Hey everyone, we are continuing chapter 15b, cranial nerves. We've just gone over cranial nerves 1 through 4. We're starting here on slide 14. We are starting with cranial nerve 5. Cranial nerve 5 is the trigeminal nerve. Trigeminal means triplets. Gemini means twins. Trigeminal means triplets. It's called that because there are 3 major branches of the trigeminal nerve. And because it has these 3 major branches, that makes it the largest in terms of how many axons are coming. It's the thickest. It's the thickest of the cranial nerves. And it has both sensory and motor branches. We've seen only sensory, like olfactory and optic, or only motor, like oculomotor and trochlear. This has axons going both ways. So we'll break down what each of these branches does. Some of them are sensory, some of them are motor, some of them are both. Or actually, some of them are only sensory and then some are both. The 3 branches are the ophthalmic. Ophthalmic means it innervates the eye forehead region. That's the ophthalmic branch. Maxillary goes to the maxilla, so the upper jaw region and nose. And then mandibular, innervating your lower jaw. So let's take a look at these 3 branches and what they do. Oh, and one more thing. They all come off, they all branch at the level of the pons. In this view right here, this is the pons, and you can see the trigeminal nerve coming off of here. On the right side in our mid-sagittal view, here is the pons, and you can see the trigeminal nerve coming off and branching from here. Quick aside about the pons, since we mentioned it before, where it is, but what does it do? It acts as an intermediate for pathways. Because it's kind of at the center of the brainstem, it's this central portion of the brainstem. That means, if you take a look at this picture down here, we're zooming in right here. Because of its location, here's the pons. Because of its location, that means you're getting sensory information going straight through it. That means you're getting motor information going straight through it. That means you get stuff relayed to and from the cerebellum. It's in between all these important parts. It's in between the cerebrum, spinal cord, and cerebellum. So you're going to get a lot of information passing between those places, specifically the thalamus of the cerebrum. Because remember, the thalamus is a big intermediary for most of our senses. To recognize the pons, it's pretty bulged on this. It's pretty bulged on this ventral anterior side. It's just anterior to the 4th ventricle and cerebellum. It's rostral of the medulla oblongata. Reminder of the terms for what we call sensory, things that go up. Things that are sensory, that's ascending, and ascending tracts go to the thalamus. If it's a descending, those are motor afferent paths, somatic or visceral motor, controlling skeletal muscle, that's somatic, controlling your organs, that's visceral. And remember how we said that the brainstem is so crucial for survival, for vital things for survival? There are nuclei in the pons that are involved in breathing, involuntary control of breathing. I want to remind you of this word nucleus. Nuclei means gray matter. There's gray matter pockets within the pons, not just axons. There are axons, but there's also gray matter. And these nuclei are important for breathing. Really, really important, obviously, for survival. So the trigeminal nerve comes off of the pons. Looking at what the trigeminal nerve does, let's look at each individual branch. This first branch, which we abbreviate as CN V1, V is 5, it's the first branch. The ophthalmic, O-P-H-T-H-A-L-M-I-C, ophthalmic branch. It is a sensory branch of the trigeminal nerve. It receives sensations from the forehead area, frontal region, your eyelids, and your nose. So this whole area, it's sensory. For example, let's say you feel pain. So there's some kind of painful stimulus. You have dendrites here on your forehead, free nerve endings that could detect that damage to your skin. You've got an axon that continues. Let me use a different color so it shows up better. Got an axon that continues through as the ophthalmic branch of the trigeminal nerve into the pons. And its axon terminal is in the pons. This is somatosensory. So I'm going to draw the cell body off in a ganglion. You can see that there's a ganglion here. Remember, when we have sensory neurons or any neurons that are in the peripheral nervous system, the cell body needs to be in a ganglion. So here we have a cell body in a ganglion. And it's a pseudo-unipolar neuron because we're sensing. We're delivering information into the pons. The hole in the skull that it passes through, which I'm coloring in an orange, that hole is the superior orbital fissure. Superior orbital fissure, we saw that the trochlear nerve went through. It's this large gap, very posterior of our bony orbit. It's part of the sphenoid bone. One simple test for the ophthalmic branch is to do this corneal reflex. A corneal reflex is where you touch your cornea, the front of your eye, the anterior portion of your eye, and you should blink. I don't want to do that because that's very irritating, but it's reflexive that you should blink if something touches your eye. Some dust gets in your eye, you should immediately blink and try to get it out. That is your standard response, and it's mediated by this ophthalmic branch. If you can sense that, that means you will automatically close your eye. It's a reflex. So the ophthalmic branch was sensory. The second branch, the maxillary branch, is also sensory. And it's just like the other first one, the ophthalmic, it's just in a different region. It's coming from this middle portion of our face, upper jaw, maxillary area. So let's say we're sensing something from our teeth. Let's have dendrites there. Axon continues into the pons. Axon terminal. Cell body's off to the side because it's a pseudo-unipolar neuron. So that would be our pathway using the maxillary branch, V2. It goes through a different hole than cranial nerve 4 and 5-1. Cranial nerve 5-2, maxillary branch, goes through a hole called foramen rotundum. I'll recap where you find these holes once I go after this third one. The foramen rotundum is a different hole in the skull. And yeah, we'll take another look at it. But maxillary branch, also sensory, sensing stuff from your lower eyelid, upper lip, and cheek, gums, hard palate, or palate area. The third branch of the trigeminal nerve is the mandibular branch. So it's going down to the mandible area, the lower part of your face. It's sensing from your gums, teeth, lips. So it is sensory. But it's also for controlling your muscles of mastication. It's also motor. It is a mixed nerve. So here's our first truly mixed nerve. You have axons that are sensing stuff, and you have axons that are sending information out. Let's take a look at an example. for the sensory part, let's say you feel something from your tongue. So I mean feel something like feel touch from your tongue, because your tongue can touch as well as taste. Focusing on the touch part. Let's say you touch something on your tongue. So I'm drawing that down here. You can have a sensory neuron that goes to the pons, cell body off to the side, and that would be your sensory branch, an example of something that you could sense. But we can also control muscles of mastication, the masseter, temporalis, medial pterygoid, lateral pterygoid. So if you want to chew, for example, we can control our temporalis, which I know is a little bit higher up, but look at how low the temporalis goes here. So here in the pons, we would have another neuron, but its cell body is actually in the pons. It's not outside of the pons. It's not in a ganglion. It's in the pons. And then its axons come along here and then branch and terminate at the muscle. Let's draw a muscle in here. There's our temporalis. So the mandibular branch is mixed. You've got some neurons that are sending information to the pons, mostly somatosensory stuff from this lower part of your face, or you're controlling muscles of mastication, temporalis, masseter, medial, and lateral pterygoids. It goes through its own hole called foramen ovale. We're on slide 18 right now. Oh, and sorry, quick aside. I show these pictures, I'm showing dental nerve blocks. If you've ever gotten work done, like getting a cavity filled or something, the dentist injects some numbing agent, some anesthetic into your gums, and that anesthetic is reaching these nerves of the mandibular branch if you're doing it for your lower jaw, or of the maxillary branch if you're doing it for your upper jaw. You're getting those branches so that you numb the pain from whatever work they're doing. The foramina, let me go back to slide, I summarized this on slide 5, just so we can make a comparison of all the different holes in our skull. Right now, where this is a superior view, we've cut off the top of the head, and so we're looking inside of the skull. So here's the base of the cranium. You can see the big hole where our medulla transitions to our spinal cord. That's foramen magnum. That's not for any cranial nerves, but just to give you some perspective of where we are. And you can see the frontal bone up here. This is the frontal bone. The frontal bone doesn't have any foramina for cranial nerves, but the ethmoid does. The ethmoid has the olfactory foramina, those tiny little holes sitting on the cribriform plate. Optic nerve goes through the optic canal, and it's these holes that are passing through of the sphenoid bone, just right where the sella-turcica is, just anterior of that. Cranial nerve 4, or excuse me, cranial nerve 3, there's 3, cranial nerve 4, and cranial nerve 5, branch 1, the ophthalmic. So oculomotor, abducens, there should be an S here, abducens and ophthalmic, they all pass through the same hole. It's a big hole, the superior orbital fissure. It's hard to see from this angle. We'll get another view in a minute, but at the back of the skull, you can see this large crevice. Here's a picture of an anterior view of the skull. So if we're looking at the left orbit, you can see one hole here. That's the optic canal. Then if you look at this other hole, this long one, that's the superior orbital fissure. You can see how much bigger it is because it's holding more nerves. We've talked about the sorry, I can't speak. We've talked about the oculomotor, we've talked about ophthalmic, we've talked about abducens, those all pass through the superior orbital fissure. There is one more nerve that passes through the same hole. That's the trochlear nerve, number 6. So we've already talked about 3. We've talked about 5, number 1, and oh, sorry, that's 4. I'm sorry, I can count. Trochlear is number 4. There we go. Oculomotor is number 3. Ophthalmic is 5, number 1. The next one that we're about to go over is the abducens nerve. It's number 6. It also passes through the supraorbital fissure. So those all pass through this one very large hole in the back of the skull, back of the orbit. Each trigeminal branch goes through a different hole. The maxillary branch, V-VIII, number 5, branch 2. Maxillary branch goes through foramen rotundum. Foramen rotundum. The mandibular division, V-III, goes through foramen ovale. The way I remember this, if I'm looking at the base of the skull, rotundum is more anterior. Ovale is a little bit more lateral and back. There's another hole right here. There's another hole in the skull called foramen lacerum. This is for a blood vessel. So a cranial nerve does not pass through this one. So it's not this one. Also, there's a tiny little hole over here next to ovale. That's called foramen spinosum. That's also not a hole for a cranial nerve. But these are useful landmarks to know which one it's not. Lacerum and spinosum are too far medial, too far lateral of foramen ovale. And then foramen rotundum is closer to the superior orbital fissure. Going back to slide 19, is that last nerve that we're going over for this video, the abducens nerve. The abducens nerve, if we're looking at this picture of the eye, this is the right eye, the abducens nerve controls the lateral rectus. We saw that superior rectus is controlled by cranial nerve 3, inferior rectus controlled by cranial nerve 3, inferior oblique controlled by cranial nerve 3, and medial rectus, medial rectus controlled by number 3. Superior oblique is controlled by number 4, by the trochlear nerve, because that muscle goes through a trochlea. But lateral rectus is controlled by number 6. If we draw our pathway down here, it's coming out also at the pons, like the trigeminal nerve, with the junction of the medulla. So take a look at this picture over here. Here's the pons. Here's the medulla. The abducens nerve is coming out right here. It's these yellow ones shown. Draw it again. Here and here. Since this is a motor nerve, our neuron starts in the pons. It's multipolar. Here's the axon of our abducens nerve controlling the lateral rectus. And this lateral rectus muscle comes like that. Since it's only controlling the lateral rectus, it makes the eye move laterally. To make your eye look laterally, whether to make your left eye look left or make your right eye look right, that's abduction. That's why it's called the abducens nerve. It's outward eye movement. It's abduction. So the abducens nerve is named after the action that it causes. Once again, this also goes through the superior orbital fissure, just like cranial nerve 3, oculomotor, 4 abducens, and 5-1 ophthalmic. Those are cranial nerves 5 and 6. Let's take a look at 7 and 8. I want to point out here on slide 20 that I've got some practice activity for you all that we're going to do in lab. Which muscles are used in which situation and which nerves controls each muscle. So if you want to practice, I encourage you to. It's going to be either cranial nerve 3, cranial nerve 4, or cranial nerve 6, or a combination. Because sometimes if you want to look like laterally and up, that's going to be a combination of 2 different nerves. So this is something that we'll practice in lab on slide 20. Cranial nerve 7, facial nerve. This is both sensory and motor. The sensory part is for taste, specifically for the anterior 2/3 of your tongue. The motor part is for controlling muscles of facial expression. Remember all the muscles that we learned? Don't forget them because they're all controlled by your facial nerve. Trigeminal nerve, the 3rd branch, mandibular division, that controls chewing, mastication. Facial nerve controls facial expression muscles. So like orbicularis oculi or corrugator supercilii or frontalis. Let's look at sensory first. If we want to sense something from our tongue, I'm going to draw an exaggerated tongue here. On our tongues, we have something called taste buds. A taste bud is actually a group of cells. And I'm drawing them here in black. These are called gustatory cells. And gustatory cells are neuroepithelium. They make up your taste bud. Taste bud is a collection of cells, gustatory cells, and they're all just bunched together. These gustatory cells get activated by things you might taste on your tongue. So from there, I'm going to draw a sensory neuron. Here are the dendrites. Its axon is going to come across here, and it's going to end in the pons. It's a bipolar neuron because this is a special sense. So I've drawn the cell body here in this ganglion. I've drawn the cell body in this ganglion. It's a bipolar neuron because this is a special sense. So gustatory cells communicate to this bipolar neuron that ends in the pons. If we're looking at where this is coming out on the underside of the brain, if you take a look at this picture that I just circled, it's coming out lateral of where that abducens nerve was. Abducens, I'm going to color it in green. No, I'm going to color it in purple. Maybe I'll do dark blue. There we go. Dark blue is abducens. The pink, that's facial nerve. So facial nerve, sensory part is for taste. The motor part, for muscles of facial expression, if I draw it in this diagram down here again, our neuron is going to start in the pons, multipolar, and it's going to extend out that same pathway, but to a muscle of facial expression, let's say the orbicularis oculi. There's several branches. So we have branches of the facial nerve that go to all parts of your face and even neck. I'm not going to test you on the different branches, but I just want you to know they can branch to all over your face because your facial expression muscles are all over your face. The hole that it goes through is the internal acoustic meatus. The internal acoustic meatus is part of the temporal bone. Let me skip back to slide 5, or on slide 21. So most of the holes that we've discussed, optic canal, superior orbital fissure, foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, those are all part of the sphenoid. But now they're getting more caudal on the brain. We're going to go to a different bone here. There's a hole right here called the internal acoustic meatus. You might see it called internal auditory canal. I'm going to go with acoustic meatus. Acoustic, it's for sound passing through. Meatus is a hole. And it's internal because the external one is where sound comes in this way. The internal and external meatuses are actually connected, but there is a distinct difference because of the pathway. It's very circuitous. And there's also things in between that we'll get to later. So it's only visible from this internal view, this inside view of the skull, internal acoustic meatus. This is where the facial nerve passes through. Now, I know you might be thinking, why would the facial nerve go through the acoustic meatus? It just happens to share it with the next nerve, which we'll go over here in a minute. Shares it with this nerve, cranial nerve 8. Cranial nerve 8 is the vestibulocochlear nerve. Vestibulocochlear. It's all sensory, and it has two branches. One branch is important for balance, and when I say balance, I'm referring to head movement. Head movement is critical for how you balance, since this is where most of that, well, this is where your conscious senses are, most of them besides touch, or somatic sensation. Head movement helps you maintain balance. And there's a special organ called the vestibular apparatus. This is the organ of balance. For hearing, we have, that's what the cochlear branch is for. For hearing, we have a different organ called the cochlea. This is our organ of hearing. Take a look at this bottom picture. What we're looking at, if we continued this passageway, we'd find the ear out here. So let's pretend this is the right ear, that we're looking at someone's right ear. We get sound waves to come in someone's ear. It vibrates the tympanic membrane. It vibrates those auditory ossicles. Remember those? The malleus, the incus, and the stapes. And then you activate this organ that looks like a snail. This is the cochlea. That's the organ of hearing. And so coming out of that is the cochlear branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve. So let's actually draw this first. Within the cochlea, we have these special receptors called hair cells. So not to scale, but here's a hair cell. Like a gustatory cell, like a photoreceptor, it is neuroepithelium. So this hair cell gets activated. We'll get to how it's activated when we get to the sensory chapter. But it gets activated, and it activates a neuron. And that neuron, it's bipolar. So this is a ganglion right here, where I'm drawing that circle. Here's the axon going out of the internal acoustic meatus towards the medulla and ending there. So hair cell activates this bipolar neuron that heads to the medulla. The destination is the pons and medulla. That is the neuronal pathway of the start of the neuronal pathway of how we hear things. We'll look at the more detail here in a second. When we sense balance, let me mention here, the cochlear nucleus. There are cochlear nuclei in the medulla. So nucleus means gray matter. There are neuron cell bodies in the nucleus that this pink neuron that I've drawn is communicating to. and then it'll travel farther, which we'll see in a second. The other branch, the vestibular branch, the vestibular organ, vestibular apparatus is the organ of balance. So that is over here. It's got these funny semicircle things, and then these two round bulges. We'll get to what that is exactly. But this is the vestibular apparatus. In the vestibular apparatus, you also have hair cells. So I'm going to draw a hair cell here. And this hair cell communicates with dendrites of a bipolar neuron. And this axon also goes to the medulla, to its own nucleus, to the vestibular nucleus. On the underside of the brain, where can you find this? It's immediately, like right next to you, lateral of the facial nerve. What I'm coloring in blue, that's the vestibulocochlear nerve. What I'm coloring in yellow, that's facial. They're right next to each other. Just vestibulocochlear is a little bit more lateral. We've talked a little bit about the midbrain, a little bit about the pons, now a little bit about the medulla oblongata. Very vital, of course, and vital for important autonomic reflexes, things like regulating heart rate, regulating blood pressure. It's continuous with the spinal cord, just rostral to it, meaning you're going to have axons, ascending tracts and descending tracts, sensory information and motor information passing through the medulla. It has to. If you're going to control your arm, you have to have information pass through the medulla. If you're going to sense something from your arm, you have to have information pass through the medulla. It's in the middle, and you have to go through it. Because of that, you have lots of axons passing through. The term for those axons, they go through those medullary pyramids, the white matter tract that's visible from the anterior ventral side. It's this midline structure. These are the pyramids. There is gray matter that's important for maintaining these reflexes that I just mentioned. The gray matter is bulging out laterally. Those bulges are the olives. You have nuclei, you have gray matter here. The pyramids are white matter, olives are gray matter. Where you have nuclei in the olives that are important for processing sound, for motor learning, for regulating heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, tons of important things for survival. Looking specifically at the pathway for balance, for your vestibular sense, once again, let's say we have hair cells in this portion. So I've drawn a hair cell, and then I'm going to draw, for our vestibular branch, I'm going to draw dendrites, cell body in a ganglion. It's a ganglion in the head, so we can just call this very generally a cranial ganglion. There's a name for it, but cranial ganglion will do. And then its axon continues on, if we're just straight up unconsciously, subconsciously processing balance, it's going to go to the cerebellum. Remember, the cerebellum is important for balance. We could have another neuron that goes to the medulla, and then another neuron, this is multipolar now, going to the thalamus, and then another neuron going to the cerebral cortex. This is for conscious processing. So if it goes to the cerebral cortex, we're consciously processing our balance. Like I know if I'm maintaining my balance, I'm trying to like walk on a balance beam or something. But if I just automatically do something and catch my balance, say I slip and automatically catch my balance, that's thanks to this pathway. This is subconscious processing. So two different pathways that we're going over here for balance for your vestibular sense. For hearing, once again, the organ is called the cochlea. Let's say you hear something in your right ear. So let's draw a hair cell in your right ear. Let's draw dendrites, cell body, because it's bipolar, axon terminal going to the cochlear nucleus and the medulla. From the medulla, we can then send information to the thalamus. And then from the thalamus, we can send information. Here's a multipolar neuron sending information to that auditory cortex. That's the basic pathway for hearing. Hair cell, bipolar neuron to the medulla, from the medulla to the thalamus, from the thalamus to the auditory cortex. We can use sound information for balance, kind of like echolocation, but we're not as good as say dolphins or bats. We could send that sound information to the cerebellum. One other place where we can send this information is to our midbrain. So I'm going to draw another pathway with an orange neuron, and we can send this information to the midbrain. Why would we send information to the midbrain? If you recall, there's a part of the midbrain called the superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus. Those lower ones of the corporal quadrigemina, those lower ones, more inferior, or the inferior colliculi, therefore your auditory startle reflex. So if you hear a loud sound and you flinch, if you hear a loud sound and you flinch, that's mediated by this pathway. You send that sound information to the inferior colliculus and your body reacts by feeling alert, startled. All right, that is cranial nerves 5 through 8. In the next video, we'll go over 9 through 12 and recap how to find these. And I'll give you a tip on how to remember all these cranial nerves and the order and what they do. So I'll see you in the next video. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.